And another inspector that I've had the fortunate to meet in person as well as on the internet and such is Mike Langner from Albuquerque, New Mexico. And Mike did a number of articles for me when I was doing Radio Guide about some of the crazy things that he'd run into in the different locations. And we'll get to some of those, I'm sure. But the main thing that we want to start with is why ABIP, what the inspector's looking for, what you should know. And then we'll have some chuckles too, right, Mike?
So let's take a little visit through what the experiences here in New Mexico have been. I've been visiting stations in our state for a number of years, and I've had a number of visits from the good folks from Washington and the field offices, and encountered a few great stories. So let's share a few as we go. First, our own compliance issue. Any copyrighted items that appear in this presentation solely belong to the copyright holders. This presentation was created for the New Mexico Broadcasters Association in order to teach to tech folks and non-tech folks alike who are association members how to do their best to be compliant. It is completely not for profit, and very important, I am not a part of the FCC. I do not speak for the FCC. I underscore this because at one convention, I put out some compliance information prefaced by, on the front of the packet, the FCC says, well, the FCC inspector came over and said, are you pretending you're from us? I said, no, that's exactly word for word your website. You published it. And then everything was fine. And we got on with the convention. So the most important thing to do, we tell our members, is to intend to comply. We all make innocent mistakes, but we want to minimize them by trying to do everything right. I often get asked who's responsible. The licensee, of course, for the station operation, but the individual people's responsibility is to know what they're supposed to do, what management wants, and to do it unless they feel it is not compliant. So I tell the people who are the boots on the ground, do what you're told, but check the rules. Another good place to check, I tell people, the office clerical staffs, particularly the secretaries who often maintain the online public information files, get this publication, download it, and every time you hire somebody new, their first homework should be to read it. Excellent piece. Now we start in with what are stations supposed to do? Well, station ID, I tell people, is pretty basic. And you'd be amazed the number of stations that go, oh, really? For example, we had a TV station in our state that -TV was part of its call letters. It had never identified with the letters TV since the station went on the air, as far as they knew. We also, of course, have had the case of rim shots where they do what they feel is a dual ID. And I remind them, you got to put the licensed community first. Well, that's a little one. Also had some stations that didn't know they had to identify their ABIP channels. When do you make it? Well, this one is pretty simple. Although, again, I had a number of FM digitals say, oh, I have to ID the HD channels? Well, surprise me, translator IDs. A number of stations had been doing it every hour on the hour with their primary station ID because they didn't know they didn't have to. One that I've not seen in the field is people using tone modulated Morse and using tones too close to the EAS tone frequencies. I think that's kind of like the rule about higher power AM transmitters than you're licensed for. It's there, it's a rule, but it doesn't seem to get broken much. So License renewal, you got to put all this stuff in your public file, and sometimes the commission doesn't. I had some stations who have not seen it in the file, and I've told them, talk to your attorney, get the commission to please put it in, but meanwhile, upload these things as additional documents. Latest ownership report. This one gets kind of interesting for non-commercial stations because I explained to them, when is there an attributable ownership change? When the entire board changes, when a few board members change, talk to your FCC attorney, but be sure and file this one. Filing dates have varied over the past almost decade or so. So I tell them, take a look in the rules, call your attorney. Generally speaking, I tell them, got to do them in odd years, got to do them on time. Got to put in contracts that may be mentioned in the ownership report. A number of stations have not done that. I have yet to find a station being investigated by the FCC, so I explained that you need to do any investigative material goes in there, and so far none have had it. This one's been interesting with some of the non-coms. Some of the non-coms I've found have not put donor lists for specific programs in their public files, and others have put in the names of everybody who ever sent them 50 cents. So I explained to them, no guys, if it's in support of a specific program, it's got to go in. Latest EEO reports, got to put that in there. What did you do? What did you have as community outreach? You not only need to do it, you need to file it. The most often things that I find, and according to the trades, things like the BDR, which I hope you read from cover to cover, public file violations are clearly the most common, but they're not the only ones, and fines are increasing. We're all familiar with these, particularly the one to Cumulus, which was noticeable. We, of course, used to put stuff in file drawers. Now we put it all online. How do we know how to prepare for an ABIP inspection or to make sure we're in good shape should a representative of the commission walk in? Well, we used to use the very out-of-date checklists. There are no longer, as you know, these published checklists. I have asked the New Mexico Broadcasters Association if it would be willing to ask the National Association of State Broadcast Associations, which has the ABIP contract with the FCC, if NASBA's resources would put together checklists and then ask the FCC if the FCC would vet them, and if not, ask some FCC attorneys, particularly ones that NASBA uses, to please vet them. It is my hope industry will come up with checklists because stations need to know what to do. Political files, of course, are often variable. The political file is sometimes executed by the sales department and then sits. I find them partially filled out, fully filled out, and in some cases non-existent. I also, in some cases, for the national chains, find that they put a political file for a buy in Podunk, Ohio, in a town in New Mexico's file. So we are also seeing wrong stations among those that are owned. Issues programs are probably the most interesting place that I find public file inspections. The most interesting public file inspection involving one of these was a non-commercial station that had no public file. So I said, let's recreate what we can. I'm here to serve you. So after about 45 minutes of pulling together papers, we came to issues programs, whereupon the manager said, this is too much trouble. Why don't you just mark us that we didn't fail and we'll just stop now. Since then, the station has new management, and I'm happy to say has become compliant. First time I, as someone visiting, trying to help the station, was ever told, let's not bother being compliant. These, as we know, are good community issues or community needs. They're typical. most communities have a great number of needs in common. But a number of stations put things that they think are needs in the file that aren't exactly. Here are some I have found through the years. You look at this and you go, how could somebody think that playing more new music meets a community need, or playing 12 in a row? The explanation I got was, yeah, the community needs more music with fewer commercials. Interview with Santa Claus, I loved that one. I thought that was good. Well, they explained to me, you know, kids need something to believe in. Having the knowledge of what constitutes a community issue and need is another reason that we need the guidance for stations from the public and broadcasting and from some kind of checklists. I also explained to folks that if you didn't write it down, if you didn't document it, you didn't do it. So I've come across stations that have done huge quantities of actual public service. A couple of them interview mayors and police chiefs and school board members, typically on morning programs, but they just have it as part of the chatter. They don't document what they did and when they did it. So I explained to them, go back, figure out what you did. If you really can stand by it, write it down. If you can't, certainly start from now. Of course, I explained that applications that are open have to be in the file. And frequently when it's a station I'm visiting for the first time, I'll find stuff that's 12 or 15 years old. And I explained to them, once stuff no longer needs to be in the file, please remove it. A number of AM stations, when I said, do you have an NRSC? They said, what? And so I explained to them, of course, you have to have the NRSC measurements. And I came across another station that had them, and the measurements clearly showed that the station was not compliant. So I explained to them, you might want to redo this so you're not showing yourself as being in violation. Antenna or common point base and impedance measurements. It's remarkable how many stations now in this age of let's lease our tower or let's sell it to Vertical Bridge or one of those companies and let them worry about it, stop worrying about it. And so I visited a number of stations where they've put stuff on the tower and it's really goofed up the feed point impedance and they had nothing about it. AM directionals of late, at least in New Mexico, seem to be deciding to run about 30 watts at night and stop having 2 towers or 3 towers, or in some cases 4, and just run non-directional because nighttime AM radio is not a big revenue producer. But I explained to folks, if you've got a directional antenna, you got to read your monitor points and you got to write them down. Phases and loop currents, that's another one. I've come to a handful of stations where the documentation essentially is non-existent. So again, I explain, I'm not here to get you. I'm here to help you make it the way you want it. Most recent partial proof of performance. Again, a number of stations where they've gone to at a distance contract engineers go, what? And they finally produce them. But should a radio inspector from the commission walk in the door and want promptly to be able to see this material, it tends not to be available. So we worked through that one. I brought this one up, by the way, just because I used to be the engineer for this one. And I have to share with you, if you look at particularly the little red trace, you'll notice the station sounds great in Denver, but since most of the population in Albuquerque is northeast of that site, it sends about 80 watts to the population center at night, where it sends 26,503 to Denver. The people that owned it in the early days thought the Albuquerque population would, of course, grow up and down the Rio Grande. That's where there's water. But no, Yankee ingenuity, we moved east and west up to the east and west mesas. Well, now let's take a look at logs, for example. Logs are the thing that will either, in its absence show that you're not really paying attention, or in its presence with good documentation, let you say, yes, we did that and we did it right. There's really essentially one log now and everything gets in it. By the way, do you have the little, Barry or somebody, do you have the little sidebar of people's faces on your screen? If you do, I'll kill this. If you don't, I'll just leave it.
Yeah, we can see a few faces, depending upon whether someone's got the speaker mode here or the gallery mode.
Okay, well now I just got rid of what was blocking part of my screen. I don't know if it made a difference with yours.
No.
So the station log can exist in counterparts. That is, it doesn't have to all be in one place. It all doesn't have to be in one book, but it all has to be available. And all the parts of it have to be reviewed by the chief operator or designee. Here's an interesting one I ran into. There's a station on a hard to get to mountaintop. It gets looked at once every 30 days. So the chief operator called and said, well, do I have to go up there now every week and write something in the log about I looked at it and then review it? And I said, well, let's change the language. It works the same way. Review the entries no more than 7 days from the date of the entry. So if you only get there once a month, review it within 7 days of the entries that are in it, and I think you'll be okay. He was much relieved. How much power are you running? This ends up being a more interesting question than you might think at first blush, because the number of people who don't know what their licensed power is supposed to be, now that many of the commission's licenses show ERP, but do not show TPO, the answer I often get is 100%. Okay, 100% of what? Well, 100% here on the meter. Okay, what does that 100% mean? That means we're running 100% of what I was told we should be running when we bought the station. Okay, and how many watts is that? And then they bring out the license and they show me the ERP. And so I go, great. How do you know this is how much transmitter power you need to run in order to make that ERP? And then there's a long pause. And over the period of the next couple of weeks, conversations often with the FCC attorney or consulting engineer, somebody who's got the original filings and papers, and suddenly the math appears. Calibrating output meters. Setting it to read what you want to read is something I've run into from time to time, including some stations, excuse me, with not precision bird instruments saying, this is my reference. Standard bird 43 watt meters, if lower power stations use them with high power pucks, it's a 5% of full scale instrument. And the meters we use for this need to be 2% accurate at the reading, their reading of power, not of full scale. So we have this conversation a lot. The manufacturer's test data in many stations is either missing, they get it, that's wonderful, and then I say, fine, except this test data does not show the efficiency at your power. This test data shows full power. You're running, if it's a 10 kilowatt transmitter, maybe 8.5 kilowatts. What's the efficiency at 8.5 kilowatts? And then comes, we write a letter to the manufacturer and we get a manufacturer statement. Modulation and frequency are interesting. I talked to one station that had no way to measure frequency, although the contract engineer could come through with a frequency counter from time to time, but didn't. And I asked him, I said, why don't you? He said, well, you know, the output of this one goes through cavities, and if it went off frequencies, the cavities would shut down the transmitter. Excuse me, the cavity is a lot wider than the 2 kilohertz frequency tolerance, because among other things, it has to let modulation go through. So no, that's not going to work. So they decided they would buy a frequency counter. Tower colors are interesting. We have a tower that I visited in southern New Mexico that was aviation orange, Home Depot orange, and white. You see, the painters ran out of paint as they got down to the bottom two orange bands. So they went to Home Depot and got OSHA orange. That tower has now been repainted. We have a couple of towers atop Sandia Crest, which thankfully do not need to be painted because the owner of the station some years ago told his maintenance people, I need you to go up the crest, take some red and white paint and paint our towers. And he did. And he painted them red and white. My favorite tower, by the way, which thankfully does not need to be carrying obstruction marking and lighting, is in a town where the city council said, we think towers are ugly, so we want you to try to hide it. As a result, the top 2/3 is sky blue, the bottom third is Adobe brown, and it almost disappears. Again, because I'm talking to people at stations and I try to give them presentations that they can remember and that they can relate to, don't use spray paint out of paint cans or even just something from Home Depot. Got to use the right stuff and use the good stuff because having it painted again real soon is real expensive. Here's a fairly common one, at least in New Mexico. The beacon that you see with the red arrow pointed to it has 2 light bulbs in it. The number of them that I find that only have one working is pretty remarkable. And if you look at these things just right, sort of at sunset or sunrise, you can kind of tell when only the top or the bottom is being illuminated. The other one that I can't tell by looking, but I make sure I tell folks, is these wattages that you see at the bottom of your screen are on your license. Don't use 110 watt or 100 watt light bulbs. Don't use traffic signal light bulbs that are lower wattage. Don't use higher voltage bulbs because they are not going to make full brightness when you get to the end of the wire that runs up your tower. Plus, if you're feeding it with 120 to start with, and you put in 130 volt light bulbs for long life, you're guaranteed that the luminance is not adequate. So 620 and 116 and proper voltages. A remarkable number of 500 watt light bulbs in boxes in transmitter buildings seem to be lying around. Tower light inspections, yep, people have got to make them. A number of stations, because a lot of our towers are up on tall hills or mountains, people from the station make them from their backyard. That's fine, but if it's cloudy, you're going to have to look at it later in the middle of the night or in the morning. So, who would move a tower? The manager of a station who wants a better signal in his market. I go to the station and I think, you know, I'm going out there with their tech guy and I'm saying, these aren't where we're going, where I saw on the coverage map. And we go out there and it's a folded unipole. And I go, you know, like your license says it's a simple series fed tower and it's somewhere else. He said, oh yeah, that's old. We moved it closer to the station. It makes a whole lot better coverage of town now. And as the screen shows you, no, they did not tell the FCC. That was another epic fail. We come back now to people putting stuff across the tower base insulator. I highly recommend if people are going to lease their tower or sell their tower space on it, that they go to a grounded tower. Use an isocoupler, that's a good idea. But by the time you get to a tower that I visited recently, AM station with 4 isocouplers and a feed point resistance nowhere near the license, nobody had been paying attention. They had, as so many have, given their tower over in contract to a tower leasing company who didn't care what the feed point impedance was. They're in the tower space leasing business, not the broadcast business. And so it was cluttered and messy. Plus, they ran the feed lines, black feed lines, up the outside of the tower. Nope. A number of stations I talked to end up having to repaint the tower, or at least repaint or move the feed lines inside. We are close to old Mexico, and we have a real problem with ground system theft. So I walk around the tower base and look for damage. In the old days, you could walk around, because I had one, I could take a field strength meter, null out the tower and walk around and see if I could find radials. Today, I have a clamp-on RF ammeter, and I'll just clamp it on to 20 or so radials and see what the current in the radials looks like. As we all know, the dead giveaway that the ground system is not intact is an unexplained rise in the antenna resistance. See a fair amount of that, and the closer we get to Mexico, the more of it we see. One of the other interesting ones I visited one time is a station that's since turned in its license, not because of this, had an old-time slant wire AM tower, and lightning had hit, so the ammeter was destroyed. So they went ahead and got a hold of Bob Grinnell at Surplus Sales of Nebraska, it's a wonderful company, and bought a little surplus antenna ammeter, kind of like the one you see at the bottom of your screen. Small meter, small scale. One of the more obscure rules in the FCC rule book is worth a read. It's at 73-12-15. It gives specifications for indicating instruments, kind of scale, expanded, logarithmic, linear, length of scale, how high up the scale the meter must read when it's reading power for your station. I visited one station that was licensed for 5 kilowatts and had a meter that was reading a few tens of watts at night. I'm happy to say that station management and engineering agreed to put in a second meter for that very low reading. Again, you've got to be able to read accurately what the indication is within 2% of the indication you're reading if it's being used to determine power, i.e. RF ammeter. Are you switching patterns properly? I put KOMA on here just because I used to listen to KOMA as a teenager, and all of that Dale Weba and They're Coming to Your Town was great stuff. We find occasionally, not so much with directional stations, but stations that have different night and day power, a great confusion with advanced and non-advanced time. So my recommendation to everybody is leave all your timers on standard time. That's what your license says. That's really easy. And don't be fussing out there every time that the daylight saving time is invoked and goes back away. One of the fellows that's joined us here this afternoon, Ken Fine, had a station that had a number of power changes with pre-sunrise, post-sunrise, daytime, and nighttime. And that one would be a timer nightmare if you tried to keep track of daylight time and standard time. I, early in my career, had a little 2-tower directional with pre-sunrise, and that was hard enough. So my recommendation to everybody I visit, just stay on standard time. RF exposure has become more and more important. People are getting better about it now, but in the early days when this was first invoked, boy, did we find a whole lot of hot guy wires and occasionally a hot bottom of an FM tower. So in places I've been and stations that have become compliant, there's a trail of chain link fences around guy points behind where I've been. Sandia Crest, practically in my backyard, is a real RF hotspot. We go to great pains to keep the public out and to keep the occupational people safe as well. It's really difficult. Part of the problem with Sandia Crest is that in its ultimate wisdom, the Forest Service has provided a hang glider drop-off spot right in the middle of the site. I went to one of the hang gliders meetings, as I've done from time to time, to try to talk to them about RF safety. And one guy came up to me after the meeting and he said, you know, is that why when I fly kind of level with the towers, all my meters go crazy? I said, yes. And if you suddenly see that it's not supposed to be nighttime, but it's getting dark, that means you're losing your eyesight because the capillaries in the back of your eye can't get rid of the heat fast enough and you're going to go blind. He's never hung glided level with the towers again. But here's the problem. This is adjacent to a public area. At the right of your screen where it says South Gate, we have a locked gate. We have TV for surveillance. We take people's pictures. We take pictures of the license plates of their cars or trucks. And 2 days ago, we have pictures of a guy from Texas in a white pickup with 4-foot-long bolt cutters, rather than bothering to call the number on the screen, deciding that he would use the ultimate gate key and just help himself into the site. Protecting yourself from lawsuits from RFR is something that I stress as best I can. Some stations that I visited ended up putting in filistrand or similar at the tops of the guy wires. That's getting far more popular now, and it is a very, very good thing to do with high power FM. Structure regulations, early on when I began, there were lots of places that didn't have them. Now it's come to be almost universal, partly because so many stations are selling their towers. The tower companies are doing what makes it compliant. Here's a well-fenced AM tower. It's my understanding that TV and FM towers, I explained to folks, don't have to be fenced according to the FCC because they're not hot at the bottom. But you really want to keep hang gliders and base jumpers from climbing up, and your insurance company really wants you to keep that from happening. We had a tall tower here in New Mexico whose folks discovered that it was being used by base jumpers when they ran across some posts on the internet, on social media, showing pictures of base jumpers jumping from their tower. EAS violations are fairly common. I still find folks that have the wrong EAS operating book. We've been stressing that a lot on our local statewide SBE reflector. And to my knowledge, everybody now has the right one. And I do my best to stress, fill out the parts inside. EAS systems, rarely, but occasionally I have found early on, what do you mean I have to connect it to the internet? This has all been publicized well enough now that it's pretty well taken care of. We still have some stations. I got a call from a little rural station just a week ago that did not get the national test and doesn't know why. And they no longer have the same contract engineer, and only he has the passwords to their equipment. So we still have out in the hinterlands some work to do. Excuse me. Back in the earliest days of warning, I was the point guy in New Mexico for the emergency broadcast system. And for anybody who doesn't remember those days, AM stations would go to 640 or 1240. And then some guy had a really good idea, which was to make sure the missiles can't home in on us, let's have stations turn the carriers on and off every 30 seconds. Well, I don't know about your transmitters, but the ones I've taken care of, if you do that, the surge limiting resistors in the power supply would pretty soon be cigarette lighters. They'd be so hot. So that clearly was an interesting idea that was ill-founded. Today's system is so much better. But as with all things, if you don't write it down, you didn't do it. So once again, part of the station log, the EAS log, and vouching for its completeness. And if something didn't happen, find out why. I cannot tell you how many places I've gone that they'll put mistest, and I'll say, okay, and why is that? Did the station you're monitoring not send it? Oh, I don't know. Well, come on, guys, we got to get this together so that when you don't have one that works, you inquire and find out why it didn't and what does it take to fix it. If you have an EAS outage, log it. Everything goes in the log. Are you monitoring the correct station? I found one station that is not monitoring the correct station based on call letters, but it is monitoring the right station based on facility ID, because the call letters are now halfway across the state. There are a handful of these that come up that somehow seem not to get the point of focus. As we all experienced in the national test, sometimes the EAS material is not well, clearly transmitted. I ran across one recently that is in the early stages of the daisy chain, and some of the stuff it sends out, if there are alerts or monthly tests, are great, and some of the stuff is really noisy. Turns out they had an indoor antenna in the room that had a bunch of computer equipment, and depending on which computers were on and carrying how much load, the EAS receiver either could get the AM station they were monitoring clearly or could not. They now have an outside antenna. Are you running automatically, or are you monitored by a human 24 hours a day? That's an easy one. I found so far only one station that runs unattended and had the switch in the wrong place, and we think that was an accident. More contract stuff that the secretaries and the sales staff management needs to make sure is in the file. Frequently, I find some, but not all of these are appropriately filed. And here's an interesting one. I doubt anybody has SCA agreements anymore. When I had an FM station, we had one because I had Muzak on it. And yes, if somebody's got a legacy one of these guys, put it in the file. Your antenna, I've only found one case where they decided that they should raise the height of the antenna and not tell anybody, similar to the AM guys who moved their tower and didn't tell anybody. I did come across a translator aimed the wrong direction. They explained to me that they got much better coverage this way. It's supposed to be directional. It was directional. It just was conveniently aimed more at the population center than at the license parameters. Now that one's been fixed now too. This is fairly rare and comes up even more rarely, but I touch on it because it counts. My understanding is you still have to have at your place of operation, we used to say main studio, we don't use those words anymore, that the public has to be able to look at and print your public file, as if anybody doesn't have a computer anymore. So I tell people to be safe, even if it turns out you don't need it, provide it. You'll make a friend, or at least avoid making an enemy, and then there's no question. And also I tell people, always remember the feds can look in your public file now all the time, not just when they come to your station. And where do you find the rules? I give them the rule citations. I give them a list of stuff that should go in the public file, and I ask them to get the latest information about it from their FCC attorney. By absent checklists, these other places I tell people you can go on the internet and read the rules. And particularly if you have insomnia, some of these will be really good for you. But whatever you need to know is there, with an exception. Sometimes practice is different from what's in the rules. Often it's a temporary provision, like in a time of COVID. Sometimes practices become different just because some rules become so obsolete and they just stay there. So I explain, talk to your FCC attorney about the commission's policies and procedures, read trade publications like the BDR, shameless plug for you, Barry. And
Thank you.
also, if your tech folks are not part of your local SPE chapter, I highly recommend that they take part, be active. We have in our state, as most states do, a list server where we all keep people up on things we think we should have as shared information. Highly, highly recommended. And I really suggest that folks participate with their station in the alternative inspection program. It gets them free, as you know, from random luck of the draw, FCC walk-in inspections for 3 years. If the commission has a targeted inspection, that still takes place, but the commission is then not supposed to go on a fishing expedition just because they're there. In New Mexico, the latest way that our state broadcast association does it is that if you've never participated, you pay the modest rate card fee. And now, as a service to our broadcasters, continuing inspections and compliance certificates, if you earn one, are free if you keep up your compliance and keep up your participation. So unlike some states where there's been abuse and huge fees, it's a modest entry fee, and then the program is free to association members. After that, a very modest fee to non-members. That's to encourage them from becoming members and getting the benefits of state association membership. And there we have the New Mexico ABIP program, my participation in it. And I so much appreciate this observation, this time to be able to visit with you. It has been hugely my pleasure. You may find some things that I could do better. If you've seen them and you will share them with me, I would appreciate that. And for the several faces and names I see on these screens who've come in and visited stations I've been taking care of, pointed at pictures of spectrum graphs, and in one case, crawled into a news card to determine that the GE two-way radio was licensed as a 4ET20A and should have been licensed as an ET20A, because in those days we licensed them just by the transmitter strip designation. I thank you for all the educations I've gotten from every visit. Thank you again.
Well, thank you, Mike. I think every one of us really appreciated this. I'm sure that you're going to welcome any questions from the field. We invite you to use your space bar to unmute or alternate A. And there is a note here on the chat box talking about tower paint. David Stewart mentions he saw a station with automobile paint on a 1,000-foot tower, not the right color and slick. Unfortunately,
Going to Home Depot or Lowe's or whatever the home improvement store is in your neck of the woods is more common than you would think. Also, some of the lowball tower companies, paint companies that I've had stations experience will say, we can do it for less. And mostly what they do is they use cheaper paint, which guarantees they get to come back and get paid to do it again real soon now.
Yes, I've seen that a number of times. They'll come through with a very cheap price. And as you say, they do not run the right paint. Mike, here's one that you might want to address. In the old days, if there was a problem with a transmitter site, you would go to indirect power and you would multiply your plate voltage by plate current by efficiency factor. But many transmitters now only have a power meter on the front. How do you deal with a station in such a condition?
The ones that I've seen have, if only a power meter on the front, if you dig into the computer screen, it will give you the inside parameters. There may be some that don't. I have yet to find one that won't. If it's one of the, if you're dealing with little translators, not with Part 73 transmitters. The handful that I've worked with, if they don't have metering, they have terminals on the back where you can meter. If that doesn't work, I recommend that you start a bonfire in the building and put the apparatus in it.
Okay. Here's another one. Where is the chief operator letter posted these days?
Somebody else may want to speak to that. I have always said it should be posted at the station's primary operating position. What used to be the main studio, but where somebody would go to contact the station to ask a question about any of its technical operation. And by the way, I tell most people, if you really want to cover all bases, photocopies are cheap. Put them in several places if you think anybody is likely going to want to look. Excess documentation is not a problem.
I've got a question, Mike. You mentioned earlier in your presentation about applications that are open.
Yes, please.
Should be put in the public file. Where in the public file is a good place to put those?
In the online public file, there is an FCC labeled slot for it. It's called Applications and Related Materials.
Okay.
Hey, Mike,
Yes.
I remember we were at a meeting, the NMBA meeting, and they were talking about the hang gliders up on the mountain there. And they showed that color chart you showed where the radiation levels were based on different colors. But then the speaker said the first thing you lose when you get under radiation is your color perception. Did they ever resolve that?
If you're a hang glider, Ken, and you're hanging around our radiating elements of the antenna, and you're looking at a map of the crest at the same time, then I think that there's no hope. Number two, those colors represent radiation on the ground and on the individual towers at the various heights where the different rule exposures kick in. We have made no measurements in the air outside of a person on the ground, on a structure, or on a tower. And we routinely tell them, the whole idea is to get the radio wave up there, out there, not down here at the ground. So it can be dangerous down here. It can be dangerous on the roof of a transmitter building, and it's really dangerous in the beam. The analogy I give them, Ken, is think about a lighthouse. You can stand on the ground next to a lighthouse and it's not bad. But if you were hang gliding right around the beam, the lens, you'd be blinded by it. That's the analogy I give them for the towers on our mountain.
Thanks.
Hey, Dave, this is Phil Kane. I want to congratulate you, by the way. You had an excellent presentation. As some of you may know, I was the first ABIP inspector in California. The program started about a week after I retired from the FCC. And I did it for 4 years. The procedures and the standards were a little different, but the things you have to check was still the same. And the reasons you have to check them are still the same. And thank you very much for bringing me up to date.
Well, Phil, thank you. And I want to thank you in particular for one visit you made to a station I took care of back in about 1969 or 70. It had a really nasty little 1 kilowatt FM ITA transmitter in it. ITA made them under its own label, and as you recall, painted them a different color, put some curves in the cabinet and called them Collins. Well, you came in and you had a handful of spectrum pictures that all looked like Christmas trees lit up in a forest. And you said, "You see this?" "Yes," I said. "You going to do anything about this?" "Well, sir, It's a really lousy transmitter, but may I ask you, please? It's dirty, but is it legal? Yes, it's legal, but it's really dirty. Are you going to do something about this? Sir, is it legal? And if it's legal, all I can do is accept the manufacturer's design and turn the tuning adjustments fairly often to try to keep it down. I've tried to keep it legal, and you're telling me it is legal? Yes, but aren't you going to do something about this? Well, after that exchange, we all had a good chuckle, visited around the station, looked at everything else. It was fine, and we parted friends, and I appreciate you very much.
Thank you, Mike.
In fact, Dane, I think you may have been with him. I'm not sure of that.
Yeah, that would have been 74 to 75, somewhere around there.
Yeah, early 70s. And Dane, you're muted if you're saying something.
I'd like to make a
Yeah,
comment.
I started with the FCC in 1970. So if it was early 70s, it might have been Phil and Dane tag teaming.
Yeah, I think so. You came out with the van from California.
As far as a state plan, now required to monitor 2 broadcast stations,
Yes.
or 2 national sources for EAS.
We were told from the FCC attorney and emails I got, 2 broadcast stations that are appropriate in the New Mexico daisy chain.
Oh, okay. And so here, in our state plan, our required monitoring, and this plan's been approved by the FCC. So kudos to whoever got that done. But our required monitoring is we're a state relay, so we monitor the state primary. We also monitor a PEP source. For us, it's NPR satellite. We monitor national weather, and then we have IPAWS. So by any definition, that's only one broadcast station, which is the state relay or the state primary station. And so, yeah, our chairman might might be at odds with you on that one, but yeah, anyway, and oh, by the way, we don't have any LPs in our plan. Those were removed. So that's we're basically monitoring 4 different sources, and when you consider IPAWS, that can be a couple of additional different sources.
Well,
But our state plan said that we were supposed to monitor 2 national sources for EAS alerts, and that's the state primary and the
National weather.
PEP.
but please understand, Dave, that I'm not suggesting that your plan is incorrect. I'm suggesting what we were told by a commission representative about New Mexico. Now, also, please understand, we've had an approved plan for years that in fact had National Weather Service as one of 2 required sources for a number of stations for many years. It's only a recent development that we've now been told you have to change that.
Okay. Is there any way you can point me to anything on that? Not that we're not going to get this fixed, but I'd be curious.
I can send you the name of the woman attorney who I've been having the conversation with. She would have to give you any reference because that all comes from them.
Oh, well, I guess we could check with our station attorney just as well then. So, okay. Well, thanks for the insight on that, and great presentation. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
As we move along, Mike, maybe you and I can get together and we can address this topic with a little tech tip and specify it a little more clearly for people that have this question.
Sure, happy to do that.
Great. Any other questions?
I have a national periodic test question, if I may.
Hello, Bob.
Good morning, everybody. Yeah, I got here late. Sorry, I was out running. Cross-country season starts Saturday. KFBK here in Sacramento is our LP1, and I was listening to my low power FM over the air, watching its Sage Deck on my computer, and the test started about 45 seconds after the appointed minute. There was a bit of junk in the audio. I've listened to KFBK audio before the test. I've listened to it after the test. It sounds pretty good coming through the Sage Deck streaming to my computer at home. I wonder if anybody else had trouble with KFBK. I believe they're the LP1. They monitor, I believe, KCBS, the PEP out of San Francisco, and another station I don't recall. But I called their staff last week. They hadn't really looked into it yet, and I've not heard back yet. Is that too personal a problem, or does anyone else know about this or have any info on this?
Well, we may have to do some digging to come up with someone from Northern California. I know
Okay,
that
it doesn't sound like KCBS, KFBK are a known problem. Thank you very much, everybody.
Mhm.
We did experience quite a bit of noise on our test on some of our stations. One thing we noticed, there was quite a bit of white noise and a little bit of a tone in the background with the audio. I'm not sure if that was generated through the originator or carried down the chain somewhere, but just
Okay, well, yeah, Form 3 asked me if there are any audio problems, and yes, there were. I heard what sounded like a gentleman's voice, perhaps Hispanic, in the background at the start of the test. I heard an alert tone, a very brief pause, fraction of a second, and a second alert tone. And then when the main voice began, the background voice was less noticeable, but about halfway, 2/3 through the voice announcement, I heard what sounded like an alert tone from perhaps the same station from which the Hispanic voice in the background was originating. And that alert tone in the background continued through the end of the audio. I have an MP3 file, which I forwarded to KFBK from my Sage Deck. So I'll call them again.
Crosstalk from somewhere, it sounds like. One of our local stations, we had the same thing. Yeah.
Again, my reception of KFBK is good. They are kind of a compressed talk radio format, so it wasn't the finest concert quality audio in my humble opinion. And there was a bit of white noise, just background radio path noise throughout this also. Whether it was like that arriving at KFBK because KCBS's audio was that way, or whether they had an interfering signal on their reception of KCBS, I have no idea.
Just so you'll know, here in New Mexico, our experience was all over the map, but the principal flaw was, or appears to be, by the time you go through a handful of stations in the daisy chain, you get all the artifacts of everybody's limiter compressor, and a fly could walk in the wall and it would modulate your station fully. So any little noise or imperfection that existed in the background, by the time it got fairly far through our state, it was existing in the foreground.
Okay, well, in television speak, I'd give this a TESO 3. It'd be obvious to the casual observer. With a good signal, would not impair reception, but in a marginal reception area, the incoming audio junk might make the difference between readable and not.
Last time, that's the first time I've heard of TESO ratings in several decades, Bob.
I think I heard it from you, Phil, the first time, or from Dane.
Well, also, I don't know enough about the guts of individual people's tone decoders, but please remember from the history of tone decoders and signaling generally, some manufacturers include a noise gate and some don't. So that if the signal is accompanied by enough noise, at a minimum, a broadband compressor will then bring the entire signal down so that there's not enough signal at the tone signaling frequencies to operate the decoder. And others will not do that and will accept a much wider range of tone input levels without regard to the out of band noise. It would be interesting to know among the manufacturers who does what.
Hey, that's all I have. Thank you very much, John.
When we're talking about inspections, Mike, you mentioned very clearly that the commission is monitoring the public files, and this is an important point for people to realize. Every other day, there is at least one NALF about the public file or the political file. And there's consent decrees. There's also the date that the license renewal was turned in. A lot of fines this past year.
You are absolutely right. And one of the things that I've gotten as questions, since I'm kind of the shell answer man for our state broadcast association, is before renewals and as they were being filed, oh, we missed 3/4 of filing. What should I do about it? And my answer is always, why did you miss it? Explain why you missed it and what you did about it. We have one station that when COVID hit and business disappeared, they went to a skeleton staff and they were barely able to stay on the air in their little market. And apparently they, through their FCC attorney, explained that to the commission. And so far the commission has, in so many words, said, you know, the COVID was a disaster for us all. You showed, you tried, and is showing them mercy. Now, another station here that here comes the phrase, willingly and knowingly didn't bother to do anything with their public file for about 3 years. What they may come up with as a story and whether the commission will buy it, I will be interested to see as the renewals are processed.
Always best to be honest with the FCC and not try to make up stories.
As they say in the movies, they know more than you do.
Now, you did mention logs, and I wanted to drop back to that, if you don't mind, for a moment, because the log requirements have changed over the years. You and I remember the every half hour days, I'm sure. Many remember going out to the tower base every half hour. That's all been done away with. And now you have the EAS and the tower lighting. But what about all the other things? Should they be on the station log or should they be a separate log? What do you recommend to your clients?
All the things that should be in the station log per the rules should be in the station log. Other material, I suggest, be available as supplemental material if you need to support something should the commission ask a question. But putting stuff that doesn't belong in the station log is something I would try to avoid, because you never know when some crazy person is going to come up with a crazy allegation and go on a fishing expedition. I once fired a morning announcer who decided to editorialize against the local electric utility and its rates and would not stop and told me it was his freedom of speech and I couldn't make him stop. Well, I said, it's a work made for hire and you're no longer hired. And that was the end of that. Our license was all but challenged when a whole bunch of his friends came in serially, one after another, to go through our public file. The good news is it was complete. And I'd also made sure I'd put in lots of letters from listeners saying, we're sure glad you got that loudmouth off the air. So logs can be a valuable instrument for a number of reasons. The principal reason is to show compliance and to show intent. And if you're guided by those two concerns, what should go in the log will become pretty evident. By the way, just to show you how things get looked at that you don't think of, I had an inspection of another AM one time where the radio inspector and I went out to the site. We look at the transmitter, we put it directional, we go out to the tower, and as we're approaching the gate, the inspector turns to me and says, well, I see a well-worn path here. You must actually read these meters. So the folks in the field who do the good work really do know what to look for and do a good job.
Let me add one thing about public files. My favorite story, I think Dane may remember this. In the early 1990s, there was a professor of communications at San Jose State University who was not particularly friendly with the FCC's rulings at the time. And he had all of his students go to specific stations, the college station, and review the public file, to the point where the station management actually went and laminated each page of the file because they were getting worn out.
There are uses and there are abuses.
Mike, you hollered at me a couple of inspections about the signs on the gates going into the sites, the outer gates, the inner gates. Is that required, or is that just a safety factor, or both?
The answer, Ken, is, excuse me, the relevant signage has to be visible before anybody goes through a locked gate or has to have something in front of them as an impediment for access. Now, I use the phrase the proper sign. When it comes to RFR, there are 3 different signs and 3 different hazards. And the different hazards can go in different places as appropriate. So one says it's dangerous, one says it's hazardous, and one talks about levels may exceed. But the whole idea is you must inform both the public and anyone coming for an occupational purpose what they're getting into before they get into it and before they have to open some locked thing to see it. That's the tower registration. The warnings have to be before they can get in the area where the RFR is hot. Also, you may have hot spots. Remember, we had to put signs at one of your sites, guy wires, that we put chain link fences around. I personally put hotspot signs around some guy wires and some towers atop Sandia Crest, they're still there, that say in big letters, do not come closer than 6 feet or 8 feet or whatever they say, or you will be exposed to excessive non-ionizing radiation. So you put the signs where you keep people out of the hazard if it's RFR, you put the tower listing, the observation, the notification where it can be seen without anybody having to go through a locked gate to get to it. Tower registration.
And who would fine you for those?
That's an FCC rule. FCC, by the way, and FAA handshake together. You notice I didn't say we use in our ABIP inspections an FCC tower light chart. It's an FAA chart, but it's incorporated by the commission.
Mike, I have a kind of another question to add on to my question I asked you earlier about the applications. One of our stations has an application that's been accepted for filing. Does the FCC actually put that information on the public file itself, or is that something I have to upload into the file?
It has always been explained to me that when the application is accepted for filing is when it becomes an application. Now, I'm not an attorney and this is not legal advice, but
Okay.
I would expect if you ask your FCC attorney, they will tell you up until an application is accepted, it is an intent to file. It is not filed. But again, check the fine print, talk to your attorney.
Yeah, okay. I'm looking at the public file for this station right now. And of course, a lot of the information that's on there that I'm seeing is all toggled information, you know, with the little toggle switch. And it looks like stuff that they put in there. So that's why I was asking if that's something they automatically generate and put on there, or if it's something that we have to do. But we'll talk to our attorney about it. Thank you.
Yeah, the question is almost one of semantics. Is it an application before you make it? Logic would seem to indicate that it's not.
Right, sure. Okay. All right.
Mike, have you ever been to a station where they have obviously recalibrated the power meters?
Oh, I can do you one better than that. When the company I worked for took over a 3-tower directional, a cursory glance at the directional parameters, everything was fine. But if you went around behind the phase monitor, the old time brown job that we used to all use, and removed the inductors, capacitors, and resistors hanging on the back of it, the array was horribly out of compliance. So been there, done that, bought a new phaser, bought new feed lines, bought new sample lines, fixed it.
I remember the story, well, old days when they'd hook a 9-volt battery to common point meters and things like that. And sometimes
Barry, that sort of thing goes outside the broadcast realm too. All of us in the Rocky Mountain West remember among others, Don Wyatt, really good guy from the Denver office. He walked into a two-way shop run by a friend of mine many years ago. And the guy at the bench was setting frequency and deviation on a school bus two-way radio. And he said, oh, you know, I've always been interested in this. What are you doing here? How does this work? And the bench tech was just thrilled that somebody was interested. And he said, well, see, you know, this Cushman, this blue box up here, and then with my screwdriver and the meter, and was going through it all. And then Don whips out his badge and says, really, here's my FCC credentials. May I see your FCC license? The guy didn't have one. So he said, wait, I didn't explain it right. Actually, I don't make any of the measurements. The meter does.
Hey, Mike, are you aware that before Don Wyatt worked for the FCC, he was a working cowboy?
I had no idea. But I will also tell you, I took my first from the FCC ham radio exam from Larry Hastings in the old Albuquerque High School cafeteria. And later, many years later, after he retired, I ran into him on 40 meters and we had a great talk.
He was a gentleman.
He was a really good guy.
No, Don's family actually owned the cattle ranch. And he was a working cowboy until he decided that he wanted to get a technical education, and then he became an FCC inspector. And he and I went out several times on various broadcast inspections.
One time, Phil, he came by because for a long time I was the chair, which was the only, in essence, officer of what was then the New Mexico Cooperative Interference Committee, which sounds like we go around and make a lot of interference, But what we actually did was try to fix interference problems on dense use electromagnetic sites. So he'd come to town, do his business, and then come over and visit, and we'd go over the who's disturbing who and how did we fix it in the two-way realm. So one day he walks into one station and there'd been a power failure at the transmitter. So he walks in the studio and I'm saying hi to him and getting him a pop from the machine. And the disc jockey comes running out of the control room and says, "We're off the air, we're off the air." So Don and I walk in the control room and I fiddle with the remote control. And I said, "Well, the remote control says there's no power at the transmitter. We'll go out there and try to find out why." And the disc jockey starts screaming, it's ratings period and it's my show and we're off the air. And he said, "What's next? The FCC's going to show up?" Don and I got the big chuckle out of that. At that point, Don did whip out his badge and say, "Hi, can I help you?"
I like that one. Dane's gone, Phil, but I remember Dane very clearly many, many years ago. I was doing standby for a local FM, and I just happened to be in the building, and there was a knock at the back door, and this guy flashes his badge and says, "Here, fix your mod monitor."
By the way, there was a time when the Denver office, like others, had a bunch of personnel, not just the engineers, but who would then go out and do things like give radio exams and do public contact. And there was one fellow, I'm sorry I don't remember his name, who at one point was here in town giving amateur and commercial exams. And I went for my second class radio telegraph. And he was so courteous. I come in and I've got my bug with me and I'm ready to take it. And he said, "This guy is going to take one of the hardest Morse exams that we offer. So I'm going to ask everybody to leave the room so it can be very quiet and be no distractions." And he went over and started the machine. I sat there and wrote as fast and clearly as I could, passed the exam, and I'm grateful to him to this day.
There were some very interesting folks who served the FCC, and in all my conversations over the years, most of them were very good people. Angelo Diddy, Phil Kane, Larry Gay, who else? Don Sprague, was it in Denver?
John Sprague was
John
a good
Sprague.
guy.
And got to know John Glenn very well from the monitoring station down at Douglas.
And by the way, Nikki Shears, who is the current engineer in charge of Denver, is really good to work with. I've worked with her on some interesting interference cases. There was a complaint that a ham operator was messing up somebody's television. They came down, asked me to represent the amateur community. We went over there. The guy had a beautiful 6-meter station, completely clean. I mean, stunning looking, right out of the textbook on the spectrum analyzer. So it turns out that John goes over to where the customer who's complaining has the cable head out at the street and discovers that there's a loose connection for the subscriber's lead into the house, tightens it, fixes it, and then somebody said, on this block, none of our automatic remote car entries work. The ham's doing that too. So John says, "Really?" And he goes over to the car, brings up 315 megahertz, and by God, there's a really strong signal. So he drives around a few blocks and pulls up in front of a house. It turns out the primary complainant had installed a Doppler. A car wants to come into the garage now, automatic garage opener, which when you use this 315 meg stuff is supposed to just make very short periodic pulses. But this one had locked on continuously and was blocking all 315 activity for blocks around. So the original complainant, who wouldn't go talk to the ham, but just wanted to bludgeon him, was forced on the spot to unscrew and dismantle his garage door opener. And all of us just chuckled quietly to ourselves and had a very good evening.
One of many great stories over the years.
That's the equivalent of one interference case that I ran, which was really interesting. It was on high frequency, was interfering with AirLink on their HF link over to Hawaii. And I'm running around. I finally find that it's coming from a vessel at Alameda Naval Base. And I go up and I finally get the deck officer, explain the situation to him. He says, I'll check with the comm officer. Comes back about 10 minutes and says, we don't operate on 8432. 8432 went off right away.
I got a call one day from the range safety officer at White Sands saying, do you know who might have, and he gave me a frequency in the low end of the 70 centimeter ham band. And I said, yeah, that's up on Caballo Mountain. That's an amateur repeater frequency. He said, really? He said, well, do you think you could get him to turn it off? It's on our hot kill missile frequency. I'm probably one of the few ABIP folks who's actually inspected Mexican broadcast stations. And for a very, very short, quick little vignette story, I went down into Juarez, met the president of the local company, which also happened to own at the time 91 radio and TV stations. We pulled up in front of Radio Central. He parks the car in a no parking zone and we get out. And a really old gray-haired bent over meter and parking ticket guy comes over and starts writing him a ticket. So he walks over to the guy, knees him in the stomach, rabbit punches him in the back, drops him to the ground, shakes his hands, the dust off his hands, and we walk into Radio Central. Now, Radio Central at the time, remember, this was before we could have lots of stations in this country. So we walk in and there's 7 stations. The first one we walk into, the transmitter's off the air. That's because it won't go on the air. It has an antenna, it's in the hallway of the building, and it's just, quote, keeping the license alive. So that was that one. The next one we went to was an old RCA 5F, an AM. It had no sides on it, so all the high voltage was exposed. Remember, those had 9,800 volt B plus modulation voltage. And I walk over to it and I look at it and there's an oscilloscope there and it's showing about 40% modulation. So I say through the sales manager who's interpreting to the engineer who speaks only Spanish, I said, the modulation's a little low, don't you think? And so they go over and grab the knob and turn it up and the speaker gets louder and the distortion is phenomenal and the percentage of modulation doesn't get any better. And he looks at me and says, you like this better? Well, then we went out to another AM station out in the field where there was, of course, no tower. The building was really hot. It had 2 giant exhaust fans, but they didn't have any motors. And the engineer that was there at the site looked like sort of the Hispanic version of Snuffy Smith from the Funny Papers. So I comment after we visit that one and go to another one that I said, you know, I don't know what you pay your people, but that's scroungiest looking engineer I ever saw. And whereupon the guy turns to me and says, it's not the engineer, that's the guard. And then we went to one more station, which was the export version of the RCA 1M, great little transmitter. It was in a cave behind bars. And I asked, why is it in a cave and behind bars? And they said, natural air conditioning. We don't have to pay to keep it cool. This just works fine. And sure enough, that's what it was. A transmitter in a cave behind bars. That was my experience. By the way, in Mexico City, they have a handful of English language stations. Except for 5 minutes at the top of the hour, they're required by law to give 5 minutes of news in Spanish and then return to their regular programming.
Well, that's interesting.
I have one
Hey.
question for you before you leave.
Sure, of course.
Dealing with the gating and the signage on the gate, do all stations that are operating from that inside of that fenced-in area have to have signage on the gate?
If you're talking about RFR, the safety from non-ionizing radiation, it's not station specific. It's area and exposure specific. So it just has to be signed so that nobody could inadvertently expose themselves to excess radiation. If you're talking about tower registration, it's the tower owner, not any stations that are tenants on the tower.
Okay, thank you.
We had to have them also, as I recall, in Spanish, but we were in New Mexico, so that makes sense. But
Oh, that's a good one, Mike. If the radio station is broadcasting Spanish language programming, do they have to do the ID in English or Spanish?
The ID is in English. EAS tests should be in the primary language of the station. Which is an interesting question when you simply relay a monthly test. It's not going to be in the Spanish language of the station. There was a big look-see by the commission here a few years ago to see what stations were prepared to do dual language. And because it is not, I postulate, a revenue-producing item, the level of interest was extremely low.
Is there a policy letter or something? Because I can't find it in 73-1201 about having the ID in English.
I will look for it and I will send you a link.
Great. This came up,
A couple weeks ago.
yes, it did. We learned things. That's the great part of these Thursday afternoon deals, is that we learn things, and
It makes it worth getting up in the morning if you can learn one thing.
we're not sure you've got up yet.
Sitting very comfortably.
So Barry, I was commenting when you got up and left, I'm supposed to run up to the NMBA office and sign some certificates of compliance. So if you're done with me, I will thank you very, very much. It's been an incredible pleasure and I appreciate you so much.
And I hope that we'll get you back for the other point that we were talking about discussing. And
Okay, thanks. Here I go, off on the magic carpet.
see you
guys
soon.
again soon.